Today we are reacting to a fascinating exchange between Kishore Mahbubani and Michelle Hussein on China's rise and America's inability to accept it. But before we begin, if you enjoy these kind of discussions, please subscribe. It really helps, especially for a small channel like this one.
The desire on the part of the United States to maintain its position as the world's biggest economy. Are you talking about power as something broader than that? A quest to become the world's only superpower?
You know, geopolitics has been around for about 2,000 years or so. And so there are certain habits of behavior that all great powers share in common. And the number one power of the time always wants to preserve its number one position and not give it up gracefully and say, okay, my turn is up, why don't you take over? It's not like in the world of business where IBM will give way to another company, for example. But in geopolitics, it's a zero-sum game, sadly. And so even though Washington, D.C. today is a very badly divided capital politically, but when it comes to China, there's a near universal consensus that it is in the interest of the United States to stop the rise of China. And that's why the actions against China remain consistent. Whether or not you have President Trump or President Joe Biden, it makes no difference. It's not about personalities, it's about the logic of geopolitics.
And would you say that that is a foolish desire to stop the rise of China, because this is the way the world is going, that China is on a path to become the dominant economic power and the demography is on its side?
Well, no, I would say it's not wise policy of the United States to stop the rise of China, because China can no longer be stopped. And the only way to stop China is to ask the Chinese government to stop improving the livelihood of its own people. Right? If you want China, that's the only way that China will stop growing. But China still has a long way to go. Its per capita income is way behind that of the United States. There's a long way to go. So clearly the Chinese people want to improve their lives, and the Chinese economy will keep growing. Of course, there'll be ups and downs like in any other economy. But equally importantly, and this is the key point, we live now today in a small, interdependent, fragile planet Earth. And our overall priority as humanity should be to try and preserve planet Earth before we lose it to climate change and other forces. So there is therefore a larger imperative need for the US and China to collaborate to deal with many common challenges in the world, rather than to engage in a zero-sum game with each other. And by the way, you know, I've used a different analogy in a former book of mine, The Great Convergence, saying that the world has shrunk. The 193 countries are no longer 193 separate boats. The 193 countries, 193 separate cabins on the same boat. You know, and if your cabin on the same boat, there's no point protecting your cabin if the boat is sinking. So therefore, there's a common interest for US and China to come together and take care of the planet Earth, because that's far more important than whatever you gains you make in this geopolitical game of one-upmanship.
Kishore Mahbubani's central point is hard to argue. China's rise is no longer something that can simply be stopped. Because Chinese people want better lives, and no government can realistically tell them they shouldn't. His point about geopolitics is just as important. Great powers have a habit of seeing everything as zero-sum. If you gain, I must be losing. And that mentality becomes incredibly dangerous. Survival has to matter more than geopolitical rivalry. But the question of whether trying to stop China is a foolish desire still frames the debate too narrowly. It turns everything into a binary. Can the US win, or is it foolish to even try? But that skips the more important question. Why should stopping China be the measure of American success in the first place? What does the average American actually gain from it? What about the billions spent on military posturing that could instead go toward repairing crumbling infrastructure at home? And why should the American public simply accept this zero-sum narrative? The US has become so focused on relative decline, making sure China never surpasses it, that it risks losing sight of absolute progress. Even if America somehow wins the containment game, what exactly is the prize? A more dangerous world? Less cooperation? A planet increasingly damaged while the two largest powers compete instead of working together? Kishore understands something important here. Leadership in the 21st century is not about being number one. It's about becoming the indispensable collaborator.
While saying that neither country should be treating it as the contest that they are, I think overall you're much more critical of US policy towards China than the other way around, aren't you? I read that you said that what's happening now is like the Cold War, only America now is behaving as the Soviet Union was during the Cold War, that when the Soviet Union behaved unilaterally, ignored international opinion, and that was a time when America acted multilaterally and marshaled global opinion to its side. It's a very unflattering comparison.
Well, that comparison has been made by other scholars too, that in the contest between United States and Soviet Union, American society was flourishing, but Soviet society wasn't flourishing. But today, in the contest between United States and China, the bottom 50% of the American population haven't seen their standard of living improve in several decades. And indeed, as you know, the indicators of people at the bottom are very bad in the United States. And therefore, the logical thing for United States to do is to first focus on uplifting its people rather than to try to engage in a zero-sum geopolitical contest with China. But I can tell you, in geopolitics, unfortunately, common sense doesn't work. Because this desire to be number one is so somehow deeply ingrained into the human brain that's very hard to persuade the policy makers, hey, step back and think, what is a better approach to take? And the goal of my writings is not to say that China should win or United States should win. The goal of my writings is to say that China and US should step back and reflect whether it is in their larger long-term interests to engage in such a zero-sum contest.
Michel Hussein frames Kishore's comparison with the Soviet Union as somehow unflattering to America, but that's exactly the point he's making. She treats the comparison almost like a diplomatic insult when Kishore is making a structural argument. He's not saying America is communist. He's saying the United States has increasingly become the unilateral power that ignores global opinion, precisely the kind of behavior it once condemned in Moscow. Where Kishore is especially strong is when he turns to America's bottom 50%. And honestly, this is what the host should be asking. America is spending enormous amounts of money trying to contain China, while millions of its own citizens struggle to afford healthcare, housing, and education. It's fighting a geopolitical competition abroad while struggling with an economic one at home. Kishore is basically pleading for common sense, but as he admits, common sense doesn't always win in geopolitics. And that's what makes this exchange so revealing.
And the standard of living of the Chinese population has risen immeasurably in recent decades. There are, of course, though, rights that they do not enjoy compared to Americans. Freedom of expression, the right to choose their own leaders.
Well, you're right. I mean, China has rescued 800 million people out of poverty. That's, 2.5 to 3 times the population of United States. And that's an amazing achievement. But you're right, the Chinese don't enjoy many of the rights that Americans enjoy. But Chinese society has got its own political DNA. which has been embedded in the Chinese society only for 3,000 years. And over 3,000 years, the big lesson that the Chinese people have learned is that when there's chaos in the center, in the capital, the people suffer. But when there is political stability and control in the center, the people prosper and flourish. And when people say that the Chinese people are not free, I ask a very simple question. If the Chinese people are not free, why is it over 130 million Chinese people leave China each year and then, amazingly, using their own 2 feet, return to China every year? Now, if China was this harsh, dark, communist gulag that is portrayed in the Anglo-Saxon media, the Chinese people are irrational. They shouldn't be returning to China. But the Chinese who are returning to China are the ones who have experienced life overseas. So China, to put it simply, is a different civilization from Western civilization. So the kinds of society that the Chinese people want at the end of the day will be different from Western society. And that's something that we got to learn to live with in the new multi-civilizational world.
I hear what you're saying. And I'm also at the same time thinking of the evidence that emerged a few years ago about those re-education camps in Western China, in Xinjiang province, where Chinese Muslims were detained, some as young as in their teens, right up to people in their 70s, because the state felt they needed re-educating about their beliefs.
Well, there's no question that China's internal arrangements are not the same as those of Western society. But when the West raises concerns about the Muslims in China, the one comment that the rest of the world makes is that, in general, the West doesn't like Muslims. In general, the West doesn't like Chinese. But for some strange reason, they love Chinese Muslims. And it's because it's a political tool to be used to embarrass China. Unfortunately, that political tool no longer works because the whole world is saying, if you in the West are so concerned about the conditions of Muslims who are oppressed, what have you said about Gaza? What have you done about Gaza?
Mahbubani gives a very strong rebuttal here. The question about rights they do not enjoy is predictable. But instead of accepting the framing, Mahbubani turns it around. First, he brings up the roughly 130 million Chinese tourists who traveled abroad. And his point is simple. If China were really the oppressive gulag sometimes portrayed in Western media, how do you explain millions of Chinese citizens leaving the country voluntarily, and then choosing to come back? They leave on their own 2 feet, and they return on their own 2 feet. For Mahbubani, that matters, because choice is part of what freedom actually means. Then comes Gaza. Mishal raises Xinjiang, presumably expecting Mahbubani to fall into a trap. Instead, he points the hypocrisy in the West. His criticism becomes much broader. Human rights are often treated as universal in principle, but selectively in practice. Much of the rest of the world sees that inconsistency. The West speaks loudly about Muslim rights when criticizing China, but can appear far less forceful when close allies are accused of violating those same principles. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Is this really about defending Muslims everywhere? Or does concern become much louder when it can also be used as geopolitical pressure against China? There's also a deeper disagreement here about what freedom actually means. The Western definition tends to emphasize elections, free speech, and political rights. Mahbubani is arguing for something broader, the freedom of a society to choose its own path according to its own history, culture, and priorities. China has prioritized stability, development, and collective progress over a more individualistic political model. And here is the point the West often struggles with. A large number of Chinese people appear comfortable with that trade-off. Mahbubani also points towards survey data showing high levels of optimism among Chinese citizens and confidence in the direction of their country, while trust in American institutions has weakened considerably. So the question becomes harder than simply asking, which country has more freedom? Maybe we also have to ask, who gets to define freedom?
In this picture that you've painted of rising China, a rise that can't be stopped, it is a country that, in its own way, has these moments where it destabilizes neighbors. For example, closing airspace around South Korea's borders, as has been the case recently, doing things that upset or worry the Philippines or Taiwan, of course, Japan at times. How do these states in the region, including Singapore, fare in that Asian order?
Well, I think we have to understand that China's rise has been remarkable and dramatic. And to explain how dramatic it is, just imagine when you and I began this conversation a few minutes ago, there was a cat sitting next to me. And suddenly, after 15 minutes or 20 minutes, I turned around and I noticed the cat has become a tiger. Now, I was very comfortable sitting next to a cat. I'm very uncomfortable sitting next to a tiger. Now, China has become a tiger. You have to accept that it is now the second most powerful country in the world and still rising strongly. And so we have to learn to live with a much stronger power in our neighborhood. And the idea that any power can be benevolent, the term benevolent great power is an oxymoron. All great powers will protect their interests. So the neighbors of China, therefore, have to adjust to Chinese power, but this doesn't mean you kowtow to Chinese power, but you learn to manage it. And, I can tell you that the neighbors of China also have long histories. And to give you an example, the last country with whom China had a major war was Vietnam. And in 1979, about 1 million soldiers were fighting each other in that war. And the Vietnamese were occupied by China for 1,000 years, right? But the Vietnamese have an expression, a very important expression. They say that to become a leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China, and you must be able to get along with China. And if you cannot do both, you cannot be a leader of Vietnam. So countries in this region, therefore, are pragmatically adjusting to the emergence of China. But I can tell you, in our private conversations, we do tell the Chinese quite frankly what our concerns are, and they do listen to the concerns. But the important thing is that, remember that we are in Asia. In Asia, you must always save the face of the person you're talking to. Please don't insult China publicly in the way that European leaders do, in the way that American leaders do, because that's not how you get to work with China.
Mahbubani's cat and tiger metaphor is brilliant, and I think the host misses the deeper implication. She describes China's actions as destabilizing, closing airspace, upsetting its neighbors, before she even gets to the question of whether those actions are justified. In other words, the framing already assumes China is the problem. But consider the double standard. The United States has hundreds of military bases around the world. Is that routinely described as destabilizing? No. It's usually called maintaining order or preserving stability. So similar displays of power get very different labels depending on who is exercising that power. And ask yourself, why hasn't Asia formed a NATO-style military alliance specifically against China? One major reason is economic reality. These countries trade heavily with China. They benefit from Chinese growth.
What do you think is the effect of this on China? And is there a reshaping that is taking place or is now going to take place because of the war with Iran?
Well, I've said this to my American friends several times, and it's also the theme of my book, Has China Won? Every war that the United States fights, especially in the Middle East, is a gift to China. So, in the 10 years when the United States was bogged in Iraq after the illegal invasion of Iraq by President George W. Bush, China had its fastest growing years. It was left to grow peacefully from 2003 to 2013. So, in the same way, if the United States gets bogged down in another war in Iran, again it buys time for China. And this the difference between Chinese leaders and American leaders is that Chinese leaders, as Henry Kissinger told me, always work out a comprehensive long-term strategy before embarking on a venture. And the Chinese do have a comprehensive long-term strategy for managing the challenge that United States is posing to China. By contrast, the leaders of the United States, and I don't mean Republicans only, by the way, it's both Democrats and Republicans, have not worked out an equally comprehensive long-term strategy for managing the return of China as a great power. And I try to be helpful to both sides by saying, why don't you take a step back and understand the other side? Because as Sun Tzu said, the Chinese strategist, know thyself, know thine enemy, fight 1,000 battles, win 1,000 battles.
But Chinese leaders can act that way because they don't have to ever deal with an election.
That's true, but in the Cold War, a democratic United States that had elections every 4 years defeated the authoritarian Soviet Union. So the constant elections in America were in no way a handicap. In fact, as the architect of the success of the United States in the Cold War was a man called George Kennan, whom I met once. And George Kennan said way back in 1949 that the outcome of the Cold War would be determined not by the number of bullets or warships or aircraft carriers or jet fighters you have. It'll depend at the end of the day which society creates a spiritual vitality that leads to its people flourishing and growing. So if George Kennan were alive today, he would advise the United States, don't try to get more aircraft carriers. Try to focus on improving the livelihood of the bottom 50% of American people.
Every American war in the Middle East is, in a sense, a gift to China. And the host's response? She pivots to elections. This is classic Western exceptionalism. The assumption that democratic processes automatically produce better outcomes, regardless of the actual results. The United States has held elections every 4 years since 2000, and during that period, it invaded Iraq on false pretenses, spent trillions on wars abroad, and watched much of its domestic infrastructure deteriorate. Meanwhile, China, without Western-style national elections, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So the uncomfortable question is, which system actually delivered more for its people? Mahbubani is probably too diplomatic to put it that bluntly, but the contrast speaks for itself. The host then tries to frame China's ability to think long-term as simply a product of authoritarianism, but Mahbubani counters with George Kennan. Kennan understood that the Cold War would ultimately be decided by what he called the spiritual vitality of a society, its health, confidence, and ability to provide a good life for its people. And if Kennan were alive today, you have to wonder what he would make of America's current strategy. Instead of focusing relentlessly on strengthening itself at home, the US is spending enormous resources trying to contain China, while large parts of its own population continue to struggle economically. And that's what makes Mahbubani's argument so interesting. He isn't giving this advice as some kind of China cheerleader. He's giving it as someone who genuinely wants America to succeed. He's basically saying, step back, reflect, and compete on the battlefield that actually matters, the well-being of your own people. But anyway, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the discussion, please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, do you think the United States and China are being pushed toward a new Cold War? Or do you think Washington will eventually pull back from the hostility and find a way to cooperate with China? See you in the next one.